The Battle of Eylau, or Battle of Paris-Eylau, 7 and 8 February 1807, was a bloody and inconclusive battle between Napoleon's Grande Armée Acute and All-Russian Empire Army under 11 August. Count von Bennigsen near the town of Paris-Eylau in East Prussia. Late in the battle, the Russians received a timely reinforcement from a Prussian division. The town is now called Bagration-Osk and it is a part of Kaliningrad Oblast, Russia. The engagement was fought during the War of the Fourth Coalition, part of the Napoleonic Wars. Of all Napoleonic battles, this is considered to be the most uncertain and mysterious for several reasons, mainly the strength of Murat's reserve cavalry. Napoleon's armies previously smashed the army of the Austrian Empire in the Ulm campaign and the combined Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz on 2 December 1805. Austerlitz forced the Austrians to sue for peace and their Russian allies to withdraw from the conflict. On 14 October 1806, Napoleon crushed the armies of the Kingdom of Prussia at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt. After a rapid pursuit, the broken pieces of the Prussian army were destroyed at the battles of Prenzlau and Lübecken in a series of capitulations at Erfurt, Passau, Stettin, Magdeburg, and Hamelin. Eylau was the first serious check to the Grande Armée Acute, and the myth of Napoleon's invincibility was badly shaken. However, in 1807 the dramatic defeat of the Russian forces at Friedland allowed Napoleon in 1812 to march towards Moscow almost uncontested. In late January, Bennigsen's Russian army went on the offensive in East Prussia, pushing far to the west. Napoleon reacted by mounting a counter-offensive to the north, hoping to prevent their retreat to the east. After his Cossacks captured a copy of Napoleon's orders, Bennigsen rapidly withdrew to the northeast to avoid being cut off. The French pursued for several days and found the Russians drawn up for battle at Eylau. In a vicious evening clash, the French captured the village with heavy losses on both sides. The following day brought even more serious fighting. Early in the battle, a frontal attack by Napoleon failed with catastrophic losses. To retrieve the situation, the Emperor launched a mass cavalry charge against the Russians. This bought enough time for the French right wing to throw its weight into the contest. Soon, the Russian left wing was bent back at an acute angle and Bennigsen's army was in danger of collapse. A Prussian corps belatedly arrived and saved the day by pushing back the French right wing. As darkness fell, a French corps tardily appeared on the French left flank. That night Bennigsen decided to retreat, leaving Napoleon in possession of a snowy battlefield covered with thousands of corpses and many more wounded. Prelude. With the Prussian army routed at Jena Auerstedt, Napoleon occupied the major cities of Germany and marched on east in pursuit of the remaining forces opposed to him. These were largely Russians under the command of the frail 68-year-old Field Marshal Mikhail Kamenský. The old marshal was unwilling to risk battle, and continued to retreat, leaving the Grande Armée Acute free to enter Poland almost unopposed. Nevertheless, as the French pressed aggressively eastward across the Vistula, they found the Russians defending the line of the WKRA River. The French seized a crossing over the WKRA on 23 December at the Battle of Zarnawa. Russian resistance soon stiffened and on 26 December the two armies clashed at the battles of Pultusk and Goleman. After these fierce engagements, Napoleon's troops took up winter quarters in Poland to recuperate after a victorious but exhausting campaign. In January 1807, the new Russian army commander 11 August, Count von Bennigsen attempted to surprise the French left wing by shifting the bulk of his army north from Novgorod to East Prussia, incorporating a Prussian corps on his right flank. He first bumped into elements of the 6th Corps of Marshal Michel Ney, who had disobeyed his emperor's orders and advanced far north of his assigned winter cantonments. Having cleared Ney's troops out of the way, the Russians rolled down on the isolated French First Corps under Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. tough fighting at the Battle of Morungon allowed Bernadotte's corps to escape serious damage and pull back to the southwest. With his customary inventiveness, Napoleon saw an opportunity to turn the situation to his own advantage. He instructed Bernadotte to withdraw before Bennigsen's forces, and ordered the balance of the Grande Armée Acute to strike northward. This maneuver might envelop the Russian army's left flank and cut off its retreat to the east. By a stroke of luck, a band of Cossacks captured a messenger carrying Napoleon's plans to Bernadotte and quickly forwarded the information to General Pyotr Bagration. At once Bernadotte was left unawares, and a forewarned Bennigsen immediately ordered a retreat east to Jonquerot to avoid the trap. That day, General of Division Jean-François Laval clashed with Lieutenant General Nikolai Kaminsky's 14th Division at Bergfried on the Aller River, which flows roughly northward in the area. The French reported 306 casualties while claiming to inflict 1,100 on their adversaries. After seizing Allenstein, Soult moved north on the east bank of the Aller. Meanwhile, Napoleon threatened Bennigsen from the south with Marshal Pierre Augereau's 7th Corps and Ney's troops. Kaminsky held the west bank with 4 Russian battalions and 3 Prussian artillery batteries. After an initial attack on Bergfried was driven back, the French captured the village and bridge. A Russian counterattack briefly recaptured the bridge. That night, the French remained in possession of the field, and Soult claimed that he found 800 Russian dead on the field. Marching at night, Bennigsen retreated directly north to Wolfsdorf on the 4th. The next day he fell back to the northeast, reaching Bergeswalde on the road to Landsberg. By early February the Russian army was in full retreat, relentlessly pursued by the French. After several aborted attempts to stand and fight, Bennigsen resolved to retreat to the town of Eylau and there make a stand. During the pursuit, perhaps influenced by the dreadful state of the Polish roads, the savage winter weather and the relative ease with which his forces had dealt with Prussia, Napoleon had allowed the Grande Armée Acute to become more spread out than was his custom. In contrast, Bennigsen's forces were already concentrated. First day, Marshal Soult's 4th Corps and Marshal Murat's cavalry were the first French formations to reach the plateau before Eylau at about 1400 on the 7th. The Russian rearguard under Prince Bagration occupied positions on the plateau about a mile in front of Eylau. The French promptly assaulted these positions and were repulsed. Bagration's orders were to offer stiff resistance in order to gain time for Bennigsen's heavy artillery to pass through Eylau and to join the Russian army in its position beyond Eylau. During the afternoon the French were reinforced by Marshal Augereau's corps and the Imperial Guard, making up about 45,000 soldiers in all. Under pressure of greatly superior forces, Bagration conducted an orderly retreat to join the main army. The retreat was covered by another rearguard detachment in Eylau led by Barclay de Tolly. The rearguard action continued when French forces advanced to assault Barclay's forces in the town of Eylau. Historians differ on the reasons. Napoleon later claimed that this was on his orders, that the advance had the dual aims of pinning the Russian force to prevent him retreating yet again, and providing his soldiers with at least some shelter against the terrible cold. Other surviving evidence, however, strongly suggests that the advance was unplanned and occurred as the result of an undisciplined skirmish which Marshal Soult and Murat should have acted to quell but did not. Whether or not Napoleon and his generals had in advance the consideration of securing the town in order to provide the soldiers with a shelter for the freezing night, the soldiers may have taken action on their own initiative to secure such a shelter. According to Captain Marbot, the Emperor told Marshal Augereau that he disliked night fighting, that he wanted to wait until the morning so that he could count on Davout's corps to come up on the right wing and Ney's on the left, and that the high ground before Eylau was a good, easily defensible position on which to wait for reinforcements. Whatever the cause of the fight for the town, it rapidly escalated into a large and bitterly fought engagement. continuing well after night had fallen and resulting in about 4,000 casualties to each side, including Berkeley, who was shot in the arm and forced to leave the battlefield. Among other officers, the French Brigadier General Pierre-Charles Lachet was shot and killed. At 2200, Bennigsen ordered the Russians to retreat a short distance, leaving the town to the French. Bennigsen later claimed he abandoned the town to lure the French into attacking his centre the next day. Despite their possession of the town, most of the French spent the night in the open, as did all of the Russians. Both sides did without food, the Russians because of their habitual disorganization, the French because of problems with the roads, the weather, and the crush of troops hurrying towards the battle. During the night, Bennigsen withdrew some of his troops from the front line to strengthen his reserve. This action resulted in the shortening of his right wing. Second day, Bennigsen had 67,000 Russian troops with 400 guns already assembled, while the French had only 49,000 troops and 300 guns. The Russians could expect to be reinforced by Anton Wilhelm von Leroy-Stokes' detachment of 9,000 Prussians, the French by Marshal Davout's depleted 3 Corps, proud victors of Auerstedt but now only 15,000 strong, and Marshal Ney's 14,000 strong 6th Corps, which was shadowing the Prussians. Bernadotte's 1st Corps was too far distant to take part. Dawn brought light but little warmth and no great improvement in visibility. The heavy snowstorms continued throughout the day. The opposing forces occupied 2 parallel ridges. The French were active early on, probing the Russian position, particularly on the Russian right wing. The French replied and the ensuing artillery duel lasted for some time, with the French having the best of it because of their more dispersed locations. The start of the artillery duel galvanized Napoleon. Until then he had expected the Russians to continue their retreat. Now he knew he had a fight on his hands. Messengers hurriedly were dispatched to Ney ordering him to march on Eylau and join the French left wing. Meanwhile, the French had occupied in force some Fullering Mill buildings within musket shot of the Russian right wing. Russian Jaegers ejected the French. Both sides escalated the fight, with the Russians assaulting the French left wing on Windmill Knoll to the left of Eylau. Napoleon interpreted the Russian efforts on his left as a prelude to an attack on Eylau from that quarter. By this time Davout's 3rd Corps began to arrive on the Russian left wing. To forestall the perceived Russian attack on Eylau and to pin the Russian army, so that Davout's flank attack would be more successful, Napoleon launched an attack against the Russian center and left with Augereau's 7th Corps on the left and Saint-Hilaire's division of Salt's IV Corps on the right. Augereau was very ill, having to be helped onto his horse. Fate intervened to turn the attack into a disaster. As soon as the French marched off, a blizzard descended, causing all direction to be lost. Augereau's corps followed the slope of the land and veered off to the left away from Saint-Hilaire. Augereau's advance struck the Russian line at the junction of its right and center, coming under the fire of the blinded French artillery, and then the point-blank fire of the massive 70-gun Russian center battery. Meanwhile, Saint-Hilaire's division, advancing alone in the proper direction, was unable to have much effect against the Russian left. Augereau's corps was thrown into great confusion with heavy losses, gives Augereau's official of 929 killed and 4,271 wounded. 1 regiment, the 14th Line, was unable to retreat and fought to the last man, refusing to surrender, its eagle carried off by Marbot. Its position would be marked by a square of corpses. Bennigsen took full advantage, falling on Saint-Hilaire's division with more cavalry, and bringing up his reserve infantry to attack the devastated French centre. Augereau and the 3,000 or 4,000 survivors fell back on Eylau, where they were attacked by about 5,000 Russian infantry. At one point Napoleon himself, using the church tower as a command post, was nearly captured, but members of his personal staff held the Russians off for just long enough to allow some battalions of the Guard to come up. Counter-attacked by the Guard's bayonet charge and Briere's cavalry in their rear, the attacking Russian column was nearly destroyed. For 4 hours the French centre was in great disorder, virtually defenceless and in imminent danger. With his centre almost broken, Napoleon resorted to ordering a massive charge by Murat's 11,000-strong cavalry reserve. Aside from the Guard, the last major unbloodied body of troops remaining to the French cavalry charge at Eylau thus began one of the greatest cavalry charges in history. Somewhat obscured by the weather, Murat's squadrons charged through the Russian infantry around Eylau and then divided into two groups. The group on the right, Grouchy's dragoons, charged into the flank of the Russian cavalry attacking St. Hilaire's division and scattered them completely. Now led by Murat himself, the dragoons wheeled left against the Russian cavalry in the center and, joined by Daupolt's cuirassier division, drove the Russian cavalry back on their infantry. Fresh Russian cavalry forced Murat and the dragoons to retire, but Daupolt's cuirassiers broke through everything and the broken Russian were cut to pieces by fresh regiments of cuirassiers. Daupolt then rode through the Russian guns, chasing off or sabering the gunners, and burst through the first line of Russian infantry, trampling a battalion of infantry that attempted to stand. The cuirassiers forced their way through the second line of Russians, and only after 2,500 yards did the charge finally expend its force in front of the Russian reserves. A second wave of cavalry consisting of the Guards and Grouchy's dragoons now charged the Russians as they attempted to reform and also rode through both lines of infantry. Another group charged into the Russian infantry in the area where Augereau's corps had made its stand. Not content with these heavy blows, the cavalry reformed, wheeled, and charged back again, finally retiring under the protection of the Guard cavalry. Murat had lost 1,000 to 1,500 well-trained troopers, but relieved the pressure on Augereau, St. Hilaire, and Soult, paralyzing the Russians long enough to allow Davout to deploy in strength. Rarely had French cavalry played such a pivotal part in a battle. In part this was because, for the first time, Murat's men were now mounted on the best cavalry horses in Europe, freshly requisitioned in the aftermath of the conquest of Prussia. Davout's corps, about 15,000 strong, was now in position and began to drive in the Russian left. Despite the disarray of the Russian center, Napoleon declined to follow up Murat's charge by advancing with the Guard. Such a move may have decisively won the battle, but Napoleon, well aware that 9,000 Prussians under Leristoc and his chief of staff Gerhard von Scharnhorst were still unaccounted for, judged it wise to retain the Guard in reserve. Through the afternoon, Soult, Augereau, and Murat managed to hold their ground while Davout, assisted by St. Hilaire, gradually bent the Russian left back further and further, pushing it back to a right angle with the Russian center. By 1530 it seemed that the Russian cohesion would soon break as their left was in full retreat. For several crucial hours Bennigsen could not be found, he having personally ridden to Leristoc to urge that general to hasten the march of his Prussian corps to the battlefield. Bennigsen's mission was crowned with success. Leristoc's 9,000-man Prussian force, having lost a third of its strength to Ney's pursuit, approached the battlefield via the Russian right and passed completely behind the Russian position to its left wing, gathering strength in doing so by collecting Russian stragglers and adding them to the 6,000 Prussian troops. Over the next 3 hours Davout was halted and forced back to a line running from the village of Coucheton to near the village of Anklepen, towards St. Hilaire's right by Eylau. Davout, alert to the danger, formed a battery of his guns on the heights of Kleinsausgarten and personally rallied his troops while his guns drove the Prussians back into the woods. With nightfall, exhaustion set in and fighting on the Russian left petered out. By then the roar of cannons on the Russian right announced Ney's arrival. Napoleon had not recalled Ney until 800 on the morning of the 8th, when he realized that the Russians intended to fight. Although within marching distance of the battle, the heavy snow had muffled the sound of cannon fire and Ney was completely unaware of events until a messenger reached him around 10:30. somewhat delayed by Lorostok's rearguard. The leading division of Ney's corps did not reach the battlefield until around 1900 and immediately swept forward into the Russian right and rear. Bennigsen counterattacked. Bitter fighting continued until 2200, at which point both sides drew off a little. After a contentious council of war with several of his generals forcefully arguing for continuing the fight for a third day, at 2300 Bennigsen decided to withdraw and, covered by the Cossacks, the Russians silently began to leave. The exhausted French did not even notice until 300 and were in no condition to pursue.